If we reimagine how bubble maps are used in our classrooms, specifically how bubble maps are used with teaming in our classrooms, we really can hit a new level of student critical thinking that we haven't seen when we've used bubble maps in the past. And that's because if we reimagine how we use bubble maps in our classroom, specifically how we use bubble maps with teaming, we can really hit a level of student critical thinking that we're not used to seeing in bubble maps. When we go to the internet and look for bubble maps, they are plentiful. We see bubble maps everywhere on the internet, but they all have one thing in common. The thing that we see that bubble maps have in common on the internet is that they all have a preset number of circles. And what does that preset number of circles do with student thinking? It really limits it, right? If I've got 4 circles, I know I need 4 answers. So it doesn't push students to expand their thinking. They're not really analyzing what they're looking at. They're more at recall or comprehension. So one of the things we can look at is how do we get some more robust thinking in terms of categorizing and organizing concepts around a topic by really enhancing what the original, or scaling back what the original bubble map might look like, right? We can start with a bubble map that really just has a center in it. And that goes back to that power of the blank page, right? If we give our students a blank page and tell them to work out their own bubble map, it really does put the thinking on them. And I know some of you are thinking, okay, that's great and fine and dandy, but I now have a team and a blank page. They're not going to know what to do, right? At least with the circles, my students know what to do. Let me talk about cognitive load. When we talk about cognitive load, we try to lighten it so students are more successful with their work. And putting in the circles helps level that cognitive load. But instead, what if we gave students detailed directions? And those directions would give the kids the power that they need to take ownership of this own map. So let's talk about what that might look like. First of all, we would want students to understand the purpose of a bubble map, right? It isn't just to fill in the blank, it truly is to organize and categorize concepts within a topic. So how does that look in a team? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure students quickly set up a team so that not only is it everybody has a voice, but there's accountability. And one of the things we can do is have every student write in a different color. And if they're writing in a different color, then there's instant accountability. I can see who wrote what as they were working, right? So the team set up pretty basically, they're just going to pick their own color. They're going to write the main topic in the center, and they're going to count off to 4. That should take, what, 10, 15 seconds? Should not be the time consuming. No roles, no going into detail, just count off to 4, everybody different color, we're moving on to the next thing, right? And so then here in the student directions that I had talked about, getting into each step of the way, how everyone in the team has an opportunity and has a requirement to participate, right? Every person in the team needs to come up with their own concept to put down. So providing these detailed directions for the team allows them to have more agency and allows them to take more responsibility for their learning. And when you see this, what happens is it looks like this picture I already showed you, where all the different circles are different colors based on which student wrote what. And so then afterwards, or while it's happening, you can look over and see which students, and hopefully that there's equity of voice and equity of ink color. Along with the directions, what about some tips for writing, right? How do we know, our students even know what to put in the circle, that those are characteristics, types of concepts, et cetera, et cetera. And then also ensuring that every teammate makes their own decisions. So these are tips we can give students for writing out the concepts. And then I want to go back a slide and talk about those arrows again, right? You saw the arrows and there's all labeled. And what is that? One of the things when we're looking at bubble maps is if we only have the circles, some of our students put things in the circles but don't really understand the relationship between the main topic and one of the circles, or a concept and a sub-concept, right? And without getting into the labeling of concepts and sub-concepts, we can help our students understand that every time they draw an arrow, they need to say what that relationship between those two circles is. For instance, for an acute triangle, the relationship between an acute triangle and a pizza slice is that a pizza slice is an example of an acute triangle. A lot of times we tend to superimpose our own thinking, and if we see acute angle and we see pizza slice, we go, oh, the kid wrote an example. But I want the kids to tell us that, because then I can check that extra thinking, not just assume that that's what they were thinking when they wrote pizza slice. So to do that, we have tips for explaining the relationships that allow students to really think out what is it that they are writing on those arrows. So that's great and fine and dandy. That's, some ways we can support students. But what about your own support? What kind of support to think out? So let's think about planning. It's really a 4-step process, right? It takes no more time to plan this type of mind map or this type of bubble map than it does one with the circles, because it's really identifying the learning intentions, identifying the members of the team, identifying the resources that students will use to create their bubble map, and then, of course, planning some mini deadlines along the way so you can check in to see how everything's going. I'm going to go back up to the identifying resources. Often when we see bubble maps, we expect students to have it memorized. If we're expecting students to have those memorized, we're really looking at recall. If I want students to organize and categorize, that's at the analysis level. Let's take away the burden of recall and provide the notes and supports that students might need in order to be able to categorize and organize. So I want to have resources and notes available for them so that their recall isn't getting in the way of higher level thinking. Some tips to think about is you want some examples. There's 2 examples here that you can use to show them what you're talking about so that they don't, just see a blank page and don't know what to do. You want to be specific about where they're going to find their information. Ensure that all the information you want them to use is present, so they're not trying to hunt up more things, right? This is not an internet scavenger hunt. It's truly analysis of a topic. And then last, set your timer so that the mini deadlines are being checked on. Some things to avoid. Avoid telling your students how many circles to draw, or you're back to the beginning of fill in the blank. And then don't overcomplicate the map by adding squares and other shapes, especially in the beginning. If students want to do that, that's on them, but you want it to be as simple as possible in the beginning so that the student energy is spent on analysis level activity, not on trying to make sure they've used the right shape. And then the last thing I want to talk about with team bubble maps is the fact that there's a couple of optional extensions that just jump out at me. And one of them is, this is a great way for teams to give peer feedback to each other. And then, of course, having your students use their completed bubble maps as a planning tool to write out a paragraph, an essay, or a presentation, right? So they can have a team bubble map and still use that team bubble map to work individually on the next thing. So as we're looking at team bubble maps, really thinking about the purpose of a bubble map is to have students organize and categorize concepts within a topic. How do you provide all the other structures and supports so that students are focusing on organizing and categorizing concepts within a topic?